I watched $4 million disappear into mud and broken dreams as the lake drained away beneath their luxury resort. The HOA president stood on her $1 million balcony, screaming at the empty crater where her empire used to float. Just hours before, she had called me a worthless nobody who would never amount to anything in this community. But she had made one critical mistake. She destroyed the bridge my grandfather built with his own hands 70 years ago. She thought she could bully me off my land, force me to sell, and complete her perfect waterfront paradise. What she did not know was that I held the key to the entire lake system. The dam that fed their resort, their boat launches, their $1 million views. It all belonged to me. As I watched her security guards slip and slide through the mud where speedboats used to cruise, I realized something important. Sometimes the little guy does win. Sometimes justice comes not from a courtroom, but from knowing exactly which valve to turn. That day, I turned it all the way open. My name is David Miller, and for 38 years, I lived in what most people would call paradise. My house sat on the eastern shore of Crystal Lake, connected to the main road by a wooden bridge that had weathered more storms than I could count. Every morning, I walked across those weathered planks with my coffee, listening to the water lap against the support posts below. The bridge was not just a pathway, it was a lifeline. My grandfather built it in 1954 when he first settled this land, back when the area was nothing but farms and fishing spots. He cut every board by hand, drove every nail with purpose, and painted it white every spring for 20 years until arthritis stopped him. When he passed, my father took over the maintenance. When my father passed, the responsibility became mine. I loved that bridge. My kids took their first steps across it. My wife and I shared our morning coffee there, watching the sunrise paint the water gold. During summer evenings, we would sit on the railing and count the stars reflecting on the lake's surface. It connected us not just to the road, but to 3 generations of family history. Across the lake, things had changed dramatically over the past 5 years. What used to be empty woodland had transformed into lakeside paradise resort, a sprawling development of luxury condos, boat slips, and waterfront amenities. The buildings rose like glass and steel monuments to wealth, towering over the natural landscape. At night, their lights reflected off the water like a small city. The resort brought new neighbors, and with them came the Crystal Lake Homeowners Association. Most of the residents were wealthy retirees who had paid premium prices for their lakefront views. They expected perfection from their investment, and apparently my modest home and aging bridge did not fit their vision of paradise. The first sign of trouble arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. I found an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a violation notice from the Crystal Lake HOA, claiming my bridge was an unauthorized structure that violated community standards and posed a safety hazard to lake traffic. I read the letter 3 times, each time feeling more confused. My property predated their HOA by 50 years. My grandfather had secured all the proper permits from the county back in the 1950s. I had copies of every document, every approval, every inspection report. The bridge was completely legal and had been standing longer than most of the HOA board members had been alive. But the letter was clear. I had 30 days to remove the structure or face legal action. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, someone had added a personal note. "Time to join the 21st century, Mr. Miller. Your eyesore is affecting all our property values." That night, I sat on the bridge with my wife, Sarah, watching the resort lights twinkle across the water. She held my hand as I explained the situation, both of us trying to process how our peaceful life had suddenly become a legal battlefield. "They cannot just take our bridge," Sarah said quietly. Your grandfather built this with his own hands. I squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of generations pressing on my shoulders. I know, but they have lawyers and money. We have old paperwork and family stories. A speedboat roared past, its wake rocking against our bridge supports. The driver waved from his luxury yacht, probably heading back to his $1 million condo after a day of fishing. He had no idea that his new neighbors were trying to destroy the very thing that made this place special for families like mine. As we walked back to the house, I made a decision. I would fight this. The bridge was not just wood and nails. It was legacy, connection, and home. They would have to prove their case in court, and I would make sure they understood exactly what they were trying to destroy. I had no idea how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. The harassment began immediately. Every week brought new violation notices, each one more aggressive than the last. The HOA claimed my bridge blocked navigation channels, created environmental hazards, and violated setback requirements that had been established decades after my grandfather built it. The fines started at $50 and escalated to $500 per week. I attended my first HOA board meeting on a rainy Thursday evening in April. The community center was packed with resort residents, all of them dressed in expensive casual, where that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I wore my best polo shirt and khakis, feeling like a farm boy at a country club meeting. The HOA president was a woman named Victoria Sterling. She was in her early 60s, with perfectly styled silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from never being told no. She owned the largest penthouse in the resort and had made her fortune in real estate development. When she spoke, the room fell silent. We have a situation that affects the entire community, she announced, clicking through a presentation on a large screen. An unauthorized structure is creating liability issues and diminishing property values for all residents. The next slide showed a photo of my bridge, taken from the water. In the professional photography, it looked shabby and out of place against the backdrop of gleaming resort buildings. The image had been edited to emphasize every weathered board and rust stain. This structure was built without modern permits and does not meet current safety standards, Victoria continued. It poses a navigation hazard for our boat traffic and creates an eyesore that impacts our investment values. We estimate it reduces property values by approximately 3 to 5% across the entire development. I stood up, my heart pounding. Excuse me, ma'am. My name is David Miller, and that is my bridge. It was built legally in 1954 with full county approval. I have all the original permits and documentation. Victoria smiled coldly. Mr. Miller, I am sure you believe that. However, permits from 1954 do not override current zoning laws and homeowner association covenants. Your property is now part of our community, and our community has standards. My property is not part of your community, I replied, my voice stronger now. My land predates your HOA by 50 years. You built around me, not the other way around. The room erupted in murmurs. Several residents turned to stare at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. One man in an expensive suit shook his head and muttered something about grandfathered problems. Victoria raised her hand for silence. Mr. Miller, I understand your emotional attachment to this structure. However, emotion does not override law. Our attorneys have reviewed the situation thoroughly. Your bridge violates multiple current regulations and must be removed. We are prepared to assist with relocation costs if you cooperate voluntarily. After the meeting, I spent sleepless nights researching property law, HOA regulations, and historical land rights. My kitchen table disappeared under piles of legal documents, county records, and printouts from legal websites. Sarah brought me coffee and sat with me as I tried to make sense of regulations that seemed designed to confuse anyone without a law degree. The truth became clear over several weeks of investigation. The HOA had been systematically buying up surrounding properties to expand their resort development. They wanted complete control of the lake shoreline to maximize their property values and eliminate any non-conforming uses. My bridge was not just an eyesore to them. It was proof that they did not own everything, and that infuriated them. I hired a local attorney named Jim Crawford, a solo practitioner who specialized in property disputes. He was honest about our chances. "David, you are legally in the right. Your bridge is grandfathered and protected, but they have unlimited resources and political connections. They can drag this out for years and bankrupt you with legal fees even if you win." The court case began in September. Victoria Sterling sat in the front row with 3 attorneys in $1,000 suits. I sat with Jim Crawford and a cardboard box of family documents. The judge was polite but clearly overwhelmed by the technical arguments and procedural motions that Victoria's legal team filed every week. In November, we lost. The judge ruled that while my bridge was historically legal, current environmental and safety regulations required upgrades that would cost more than rebuilding from scratch. I had 60 days to comply or face demolition. That night, I sat on my bridge for what I thought might be the last time. The resort lights reflected off the water like a constellation of wealth and power, mocking my defeat. I had fought the system and lost, just like David Crawford had predicted. But I was not ready to give up, not yet. December 15th arrived gray and cold, with a bitter wind that cut across the lake like a blade. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the convoy of trucks roll down the main road toward my property. 3 construction vehicles, a crane, and 2 sheriff's cars. Behind them, a black SUV that I recognized as Victoria Sterling's personal vehicle. Sarah stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder. Our 2 teenage kids, Emma and Jake, pressed against the window on my other side. We watched in silence as the demolition crew set up their equipment at the base of our bridge. "Dad, can they really do this?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I could not answer. My throat felt tight, and my hands were shaking with rage and helplessness. After months of legal battles, appeals, and desperate negotiations, this moment had finally arrived. They were going to destroy 70 years of family history, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Sheriff Deputy Martinez approached the house with official papers. He was a good man who had grown up in this area, and I could see the discomfort in his eyes as he handed me the court order. "I am sorry, David," he said quietly. "I have to enforce this, but I want you to know that most folks in town think this is wrong." "I know, Martinez. You are just doing your job." Victoria Sterling climbed out of her SUV wearing a designer coat and expensive boots. She walked to the edge of my property line and stood there like a general surveying a battlefield. When she saw me watching from the window, she actually smiled and gave a little wave. The demolition foreman knocked on my door at exactly 9 a.m. He was a weathered man in his 50s who looked uncomfortable with the situation. "Mr. Miller, we need to begin the removal process. You and your family need to stay clear of the work area for safety reasons." "How long will it take?" I asked. "Should be done by noon. We will try to minimize damage to your property, but there might be some disturbance to your shoreline." I nodded and gathered my family on the deck behind our house. From there, we had a perfect view of the bridge that had connected us to the world for our entire lives. The morning sun broke through the clouds just as the first chainsaw roared to life. They started with the railings, 70-year-old wood that had been carved and shaped by my grandfather's hands fell into the lake with soft splashes. Emma started crying when the first section disappeared. Jake put his arm around her shoulders, trying to be strong, but I could see tears in his eyes, too. The support posts came next. Each one had been driven deep into the lake bottom by my grandfather using equipment he had borrowed from a local construction company. The crew used a hydraulic puller to extract them, and each post came up with a sucking sound that felt like the lake was screaming. By 10 a.m., half the bridge was gone. Pieces of wood floated on the surface like the remains of a shipwreck. The demolition crew worked efficiently, but I could tell they were not enjoying their job. None of them made eye contact with my family. Victoria Sterling walked closer to watch the destruction. She had brought a professional photographer who was documenting the removal process, probably for insurance or legal purposes. At one point, she pointed at something and laughed, sharing a joke with one of her associates. The final blow came when they removed the main support beam. This was the largest piece of timber in the entire structure, a massive oak beam that my grandfather had personally selected and shaped. It had supported the weight of 3 generations of my family, countless visitors, and decades of lake storms. When the crane lifted it out of the water, something inside me broke. That beam was not just wood. It was the spine of our connection to the outside world, the foundation of our independence, the physical manifestation of everything my grandfather had built for his family. The beam swung slowly through the air, dripping lake water before being lowered onto a truck bed. In that moment, I realized we were no longer homeowners. We had become prisoners on our own island, cut off from the road, dependent on boat transportation for everything from groceries to medical emergencies. By noon, it was over. 70 years of family heritage had been reduced to a pile of lumber on the back of trucks. The demolition crew cleaned up their equipment and drove away, leaving behind only the concrete footings that had once supported our bridge. Victoria Sterling approached the edge of my property one final time before leaving. She cupped her hands around her mouth and called across the water. "Mr. Miller, I hope you understand that this was necessary for the community. When you are ready to discuss selling your property, my office is always open to reasonable offers." That evening, I stood alone where my bridge used to be. The water lapped gently against the remaining concrete footings, and I could see the lights of the resort twinkling across the lake. My family was trapped behind me, and the people who had done this to us were celebrating their victory in luxury condos that cost more than I would earn in a lifetime. I had never felt more alone or more angry in my entire life, but as I stood there in the darkness, a new thought began to form in my mind. They had won this battle by using their wealth and connections against me, but they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed I was powerless. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The isolation hit us immediately. Simple tasks that we had taken for granted became major obstacles. Grocery shopping required loading everything into a small boat, and hopping the weather cooperated. When Sarah needed to get to work, she had to park her car at the marina and paddle across the lake. The kids missed school twice in the first week because of morning fog that made boat travel dangerous. Our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had the worst situation. She was 83 years old and relied on regular visits from her home health aide. After the bridge demolition, The aide could not reach her house, and Mrs. Patterson was forced to move in with her daughter in town. She had lived on the lake for 40 years, and watching her pack up her life because of Victoria Sterling's power play filled me with rage. I spent the long winter evenings researching everything I could find about the Crystal Lake HOA, Victoria Sterling, and the resort development. What I discovered was a web of corruption and greed that went far deeper than I had imagined. Victoria Sterling was not just the HOA president. She was the primary investor in Lakeside Paradise Resort and owned controlling interests in the construction companies that built it. She had systematically purchased lakefront properties over the past decade, often pressuring elderly residents to sell by creating artificial problems with their septic systems, well water, or property access. The resort's financial success depended entirely on maintaining the illusion of an exclusive, pristine lakefront community. Every marketing brochure featured photos of crystal-clear water, luxury boat slips, and unobstructed lake views. My modest house and aging bridge had been visible in the background of many promotional photos, and I could see why that irritated potential buyers looking for perfection. But the deeper I dug, the more suspicious details I found. The resort's construction permits had been approved with unusual speed, despite environmental concerns raised by local conservation groups. Several HOA board members had received lucrative consulting contracts from companies owned by Victoria Sterling. The lake's boat launch fees had been raised to levels that priced out local residents, effectively turning a public resource into a private playground. The most shocking discovery came when I started researching the lake itself. Crystal Lake was not a natural body of water. It had been created in the 1920s when the county built a dam across Miller Creek to provide water for local farms and mills. The dam was still there, hidden in the woods at the northern end of the lake, and it was still functional. More importantly, the dam was located on land that had been owned by my family since 1923. My great-grandfather had purchased the property from the county when they no longer needed it for agricultural purposes. The deed was buried in a box of family papers in our attic, yellow with age, but still legally valid. I spent weeks researching water rights law and dam operation procedures. What I learned changed everything. As the owner of the land containing the dam, I had legal authority over the water levels in Crystal Lake. The county had granted those rights to my great-grandfather in 1925, and they had never been revoked or transferred. The resort's entire business model depended on maintained water levels. Their boat slips, waterfront restaurants, and luxury amenities were all built at specific elevations designed to take advantage of the lake's depth and shoreline access. If the water level dropped significantly, their $4 million investment would become a collection of buildings overlooking a muddy crater. I contacted a water rights attorney in the state capital, a specialist named Patricia Hendricks who had handled similar cases involving historical dam ownership. She reviewed my documentation and confirmed my suspicions. "Mr. Miller, you have clear legal authority over this dam system. The water rights are grandfathered and protected under state law. As long as you follow proper environmental procedures and notify the county of your intentions, you can legally adjust water levels for maintenance, flood control, or drought management." "What would happen if I drained the lake?" I asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "That would be within your legal rights, assuming you follow the proper procedures. Of course, it would have significant environmental and economic impacts. Any decision like that would need to be carefully considered." That night, I drove my boat to the northern end of the lake and found the dam. It was a concrete structure about 30 feet high, hidden among old-growth trees and accessible only by a narrow dirt road. The control mechanism was simple but effective, a series of steel wheels that could open flood gates to release water downstream. I stood there in the moonlight, looking at the machinery that controlled Victoria Sterling's empire. She had used wealth and legal manipulation to destroy my family's heritage. She had forced elderly neighbors from their homes and turned a community resource into a private playground for the wealthy. But she had made one critical error. She had assumed that power only came from money and connections. She had never considered that sometimes real power comes from owning exactly the right piece of land at exactly the right time. As I walked back to my boat, I began to formulate a plan that would give Victoria Sterling and her HOA a lesson in consequences they would never forget. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the busy season at Lakeside Paradise Resort. From my kitchen window, I could see the increased boat traffic as wealthy guests arrived for extended stays. The marina was full of expensive yachts, and the waterfront restaurants were packed with people enjoying their lakeside paradise. Victoria Sterling had been busy, too. She had launched a new marketing campaign promoting Crystal Lake as the crown jewel of luxury lakefront living. The brochures featured professional photos of the resort taken from every angle, emphasizing the pristine water views and exclusive atmosphere. Not surprisingly, my property had been carefully cropped out of every image. I received another letter from her office in April, this time offering to purchase my property for significantly below market value. The letter was polite but firm, explaining that my isolated location and access challenges made my property less valuable than comparable lakefront homes. She was offering me a way out of my difficult situation with generous terms that would allow me to start fresh in a more suitable location. I threw the letter in the trash and continued my research. The plan that took shape over those spring months was elegant in its simplicity. I would use my legal authority over the dam to drain Crystal Lake during the peak of resort season, when maximum guests and revenue were at stake. The timing would be critical, late enough in the season to cause maximum financial damage, but early enough to avoid winter weather complications. I consulted with environmental lawyers to ensure my actions would be completely legal. Patricia Hendricks helped me understand the proper procedures for dam operation and environmental notification. I would need to file notices with the county environmental office, document my reasons for the water level adjustment, and follow specific protocols for protecting fish and wildlife during the process. The legal justification was straightforward: dam maintenance and flood control. The structure was nearly 100 years old and had never received a comprehensive inspection or maintenance procedure. Draining the lake would allow for proper evaluation of the dam's condition and any necessary repairs to ensure public safety. I spent weeks documenting the HOA's continued harassment and illegal attempts to force me to sell my property. Every violation notice, every legal threat, and every attempt to restrict my access to public resources was carefully filed and photographed. Victoria Sterling's pattern of behavior toward longtime residents was well documented, and several of my former neighbors were willing to provide statements about her pressure tactics. The psychological preparation was the hardest part. I was planning to take an action that would destroy millions of dollars in property value and potentially ruin the livelihoods of resort employees who had nothing to do with Victoria Sterling's vendetta against me. I wrestled with the moral implications for weeks, lying awake at night and questioning whether revenge was worth the collateral damage. But every time I started to have doubts, I would remember the morning they destroyed my bridge. I would think about Mrs. Patterson being forced from her home, about my kids missing school because we were trapped on an island, about 70 years of family history being loaded onto trucks and hauled away like garbage. Victoria Sterling had made her choice when she decided to use her wealth and power to destroy my family's legacy. She had shown no mercy, no consideration for the human cost of her actions, and no respect for the history and community that existed before her resort empire. She had created this situation, and she would have to live with the consequences. The final factor that eliminated my remaining guilt was discovering the extent of the HOA's illegal activities. My research had uncovered evidence of bid rigging on construction contracts, kickbacks to local officials, and environmental violations that had been covered up during the resort's construction. Victoria Sterling was not an innocent businesswoman protecting her investment. She was a corrupt developer who had built her empire on manipulation and illegal activities. In June, I filed the proper notices with the County Environmental Office, declaring my intention to perform maintenance on the Miller Creek Dam system. The paperwork was processed routinely, and I received official approval for the water level adjustment within 2 weeks. I also hired a private investigator to document the resort's peak occupancy levels and revenue patterns. The information confirmed that late July and early August were their most profitable weeks, when luxury suites rented for premium prices and their restaurants and amenities generated maximum income. The date was set, August 15th, a Saturday morning when the resort would be at full capacity with weekend guests and wedding parties. The weather forecast showed clear skies and calm winds, perfect conditions for what I had planned. I spent the final weeks creating multiple backup plans and legal safeguards. I documented every step of my decision-making process, every legal consultation, and every attempt to resolve the situation through normal channels. If Victoria Sterling wanted to challenge my actions in court, she would discover that I had followed every law, regulation, and procedure perfectly. On the night of August 14th, I sat on my back deck and looked across the lake at the glittering lights of Lakeside Paradise Resort. Tomorrow, those lights would be reflecting off mud instead of water. Tomorrow, Victoria Sterling would learn that real power does not always come from money and connections. Sometimes it comes from owning exactly the right piece of land and knowing exactly which valve to turn. I woke up at 5 a.m. on Saturday, August 15th, with my heart pounding like I was about to jump out of an airplane. The morning was clear and calm, with mist rising from the lake's surface in the early sunlight. Across the water, I could see the resort was fully occupied. Every parking space was filled. Every balcony had furniture and personal items, and several wedding tents were set up on the waterfront lawn. Sarah was already awake, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a worried expression. We had talked about this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, the magnitude of what I was about to do felt overwhelming. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. I kissed her forehead and squeezed her hand. "They destroyed our bridge. They forced Mrs. Patterson from her home. They have been systematically bullying every long-time resident off this lake. This is not just about revenge, Sarah. This is about justice." I loaded my tools into the boat and made the short trip to the northern end of the lake. The dam was exactly as I had left it during my previous visits. A concrete structure hidden among the trees, with steel control wheels that had been painted and maintained by county workers for decades. The operation was surprisingly simple. I turned the first wheel counterclockwise, and immediately heard the sound of rushing water as the primary flood gate began to open. The sound was like a waterfall, echoing through the woods as thousands of gallons per minute began flowing downstream toward Miller Creek. I opened the second gate, then the third. Within minutes, all 5 flood gates were fully open, and the sound of rushing water had become a roar that could be heard across the entire northern end of the lake. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of justice being served. The water level began dropping immediately. At first, the change was barely noticeable, but within 30 minutes, I could see the shoreline expanding as the lake's surface dropped inch by inch. The process was irreversible now. Even if I changed my mind and closed the gates, it would take weeks for the lake to refill. I returned to my house and positioned myself on the back deck with a pair of binoculars and a cup of coffee. From there, I had a perfect view of the resort and could watch the chaos unfold in real time. By 8 a.m., the water level had dropped 3 feet. The first signs of panic appeared when guests at the waterfront restaurant noticed that their boat slips were becoming shallow. Several people were pointing at the water and having animated conversations with resort staff. By 9 a.m., the water level had dropped 6 feet. Boat propellers were hitting the lake bottom, and several expensive yachts were listing to one side as they settled into the mud. The resort's general manager was running between different areas of the property, talking frantically on his cell phone. By 10 a.m., the water level had dropped 10 feet. The disaster was becoming obvious to everyone. The luxury boat slips were completely unusable, with million-dollar yachts sitting in mud like beached whales. The waterfront restaurant's outdoor deck was now 15 feet above the water line, and the scenic lake views had been replaced by an expanding expanse of brown mud and stranded boats. Victoria Sterling appeared on her penthouse balcony at 10:30 a.m. Even from across the lake, I could see her gesturing wildly and pointing at the receding water line. She was wearing a white robe and appeared to be screaming at someone on her phone. The chaos accelerated as the morning progressed. Resort guests were checking out in droves, demanding refunds and threatening lawsuits. Wedding parties were canceling their ceremonies as the romantic lakefront setting transformed into a muddy wasteland. The resort's shuttle boats were stranded on the lake bottom, unable to transport guests to their cars. Emergency vehicles arrived around noon. Fire trucks, ambulances, and county officials descended on the resort as reports of a lake emergency spread through the area. I watched through my binoculars as Victoria Sterling met with the officials, pointing dramatically at the empty lake bed and demanding immediate action. The funniest moment came when the county environmental officer arrived and began questioning resort staff about possible dam tampering or illegal water diversion. Victoria Sterling was gesturing frantically toward my property, clearly trying to blame me for the situation. The environmental officer listened politely, then pulled out a clipboard and began showing her official documents. I could not hear the conversation, but I could see Victoria Sterling's face change from angry confidence to shocked disbelief as she realized that my actions were completely legal. The environmental officer was showing her my permits, my notifications, and my legal authority over the dam system. By 2 p.m., the lake was down 20 feet from its normal level. The resort's $4 million investment was now a collection of buildings overlooking a muddy crater filled with stranded boats and dead fish. The smell of rotting aquatic vegetation was beginning to drift across the area, and clouds of flies were gathering around the exposed lake bottom. Victoria Sterling made one final appearance on her balcony at 3 p.m. This time, she was not screaming or gesturing. She was just standing there, looking out at the destruction of her empire. Her luxury resort had been transformed into an expensive monument to greed and corruption. I raised my binoculars and looked directly at her. For a moment, our eyes met across the empty lake bed. I raised my coffee cup in a mock toast, acknowledging the completion of my revenge. She turned and walked back into her penthouse, but not before I saw something on her face that I had never seen before. Fear. For the first time since this whole conflict began, Victoria Sterling was afraid. The little guy had won. Justice had been served, and it felt absolutely perfect. The aftermath was swift and devastating for Victoria Sterling and her HOA empire. By Sunday morning, the story had spread throughout the region. Local news crews arrived to film the empty lake bed and interview stranded resort guests. The headline on the evening news was "Lakefront Resort Drained by Property Dispute. Millions in Damages." The story went viral on social media within hours. Videos of expensive yachts sitting in mud, wedding parties standing on dry lake beds, and resort guests demanding refunds were shared thousands of times. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive of my actions, with people calling me a working-class hero, and Victoria Sterling a rich bully who got what she deserved. Victoria Sterling tried desperately to control the narrative. She held a press conference on Monday, flanked by her expensive lawyers, claiming that I had committed an act of economic terrorism against innocent resort guests and employees. She demanded that local authorities arrest me and force me to restore the lake immediately. The press conference backfired spectacularly. Reporters had done their research and asked pointed questions about the HOA's harassment of longtime residents, the destruction of my family's bridge, and the questionable permits that had allowed the resort's construction. When asked about Mrs. Patterson being forced from her home, Victoria Sterling claimed she had no knowledge of individual resident situations. Environmental authorities praised my actions as a necessary maintenance procedure that had been properly authorized and executed. The county environmental officer gave an interview explaining that the dam was overdue for inspection and that draining the lake was the responsible approach to ensuring public safety. The resort's financial collapse happened faster than anyone expected. Within a week, 3 major investors had pulled out of the project, citing reputational damage and unforeseen environmental risks. The resort's management company canceled their contract, and several employees filed lawsuits claiming they had not been paid for their final weeks of work. Individual HOA members began turning against Victoria Sterling as they realized the full scope of the disaster. Property values throughout the development plummeted as potential buyers saw images of the empty lake bed and stranded boats. Several homeowners filed lawsuits against the HOA board, claiming they had been misled about the security of their lakefront investments. The most satisfying moment came when Victoria Sterling's own legal team abandoned her. Her lawyers withdrew from all pending cases after discovering the evidence of bid rigging and environmental violations that I had uncovered during my research. They issued a statement saying they could not represent a client facing potential criminal charges for corruption. 2 weeks after the lake was drained, Victoria Sterling requested a meeting. She arrived at my property in a small motorboat, since the resort's shuttle service was no longer operational. She had to walk across the muddy lake bed to reach my shoreline, ruining her expensive shoes and designer clothes in the process. "Mr. Miller," she said, trying to maintain her composure despite being covered in mud. "I think we need to discuss a resolution to this situation." I stood on my back deck, looking down at her as she struggled to maintain her footing on the slippery lake bottom. The power dynamic had completely reversed. She was now the one asking for help, and I was the one in control. "What kind of resolution did you have in mind?" I asked. "I am prepared to fund the reconstruction of your bridge," she said. "Full replacement with modern materials and professional installation. I will also establish a fund to compensate other residents who may have been affected by our development activities." "And what do you want in return?" "I need you to restore the lake levels. My investors are demanding immediate action, and I cannot afford to keep the lake drained much longer." I considered her offer carefully. The truth was, I had never intended to keep the lake drained permanently. My goal had been to demonstrate that actions have consequences, and that wealthy bullies cannot destroy people's lives without facing justice. "I will restore the lake on one condition," I said. "You will publicly apologize for your harassment of longtime residents, and you will resign from the HOA board immediately." Victoria Sterling's face went through a range of emotions: anger, humiliation, and finally resignation. She had no choice, and we both knew it. 3 days later, she held another press conference. This time, she apologized for misunderstandings with longtime residents and announced her resignation from all leadership positions in the HOA. She looked defeated and humiliated, a stark contrast to the confident power broker who had destroyed my bridge 9 months earlier. HOA destroyed my lake bridge, so I reopened the dam gates that afternoon, and Crystal Lake began to refill. It took 3 weeks for the water to return to normal levels, and another month for the ecosystem to recover from the disruption. Most of the stranded boats were salvaged, though several expensive yachts had suffered permanent damage from sitting in the mud. The new bridge was completed in October, just as the fall colors were reaching their peak around the lake. It was built to modern standards, but designed to match the original structure that my grandfather had created 70 years earlier. When I walked across it for the first time, I felt like I was reconnecting with 3 generations of family history. Victoria Sterling sold her penthouse and left the area before winter arrived. The resort was eventually purchased by a management company that focused on family-friendly vacation rentals rather than exclusive luxury accommodations. The new owners removed the discriminatory boat launch fees and opened the facilities to local residents. Mrs. Patterson moved back to her lakefront home in the spring, assisted by a new HOA board that actually served the community instead of exploiting it. She invited my family for dinner and told us stories about the lake from before the dam was built, when it was just Miller Creek running through farmland. The legal vindication was complete when the state attorney general opened an investigation into Victoria Sterling's business practices. The evidence I had gathered during my research led to criminal charges for bid rigging and environmental fraud. She eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and paid substantial fines, though she avoided jail time. The story became a legend in our community and beyond. I received letters from people across the country who had faced similar battles with HOAs, wealthy developers, and corrupt local officials. Many of them thanked me for proving that regular people could still fight back against the system and win. Today, I sit on my bridge every morning with my coffee, watching the sunrise paint the water gold. The resort still operates across the lake, but it coexists peacefully with long-time residents like myself. The HOA has new leadership that focuses on actual community service rather than power games and harassment. My kids learned something important from this experience. They learned that standing up for what is right sometimes requires taking risks and making sacrifices. They learned that wealth and power are not always enough to defeat truth and determination. Most importantly, they learned that family legacy is worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the opposition might seem. The bridge my grandfather built with his own hands is gone, but the new bridge carries the same spirit of independence and connection that he intended. It stands as a monument to the idea that some things are more important than money, and that justice sometimes comes to those who are patient enough to wait for the right moment to act. Victoria Sterling thought she could destroy my family's heritage and force me off my land through legal manipulation and financial pressure. She learned that real power does not always come from wealth and connections. Sometimes, it comes from knowing your rights, understanding your community's history, and having the courage to turn the right valve at exactly the right time. The lake is full again, the fish have returned, and life has settled into a new normal. But everyone in this community knows the story of the day the little guy fought back and won. It gives hope to anyone who has ever felt powerless against wealth and corruption. And whenever I see a rich bully trying to push around regular folks, I smile and remember the look on Victoria Sterling's face when she realized that her $4 million empire was draining away into the mud. Some lessons are worth $4 million to teach.